Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all of my grain and my goods. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich toward God." And all God's people said, Amen. You may be seated. So most of you know that my former career was in insurance. I sold health insurance products for over about 20 years or more. But you probably don't know that my first insurance job was actually a life insurance job. My first 2 years in the insurance business, I sold primarily life insurance and investments. And we used to do what we called kitchen table sales. You would go to the people's homes and sit down with them and talk about their financial needs in their home. And most of the time, people would say, well, I need to save money for retirement. I need to save money for my children's college education and that sort of thing. And I was taught in the classic life insurance school of selling life insurance. And so at some point during every conversation, I would ask the question, what if you died tonight? All right, all your plans for retirement, all your plans for your children's college education are predicated on you continuing to work and provide. But what would happen if you died tonight? Who would provide for your children? Who would provide for your spouse's retirement? And that question was an important one because if someone died tonight, they needed to have life insurance in order to provide for their loved ones. And so as I read through this passage, it reminded me of those days. And frankly, the man in this passage should have asked himself, what if I die tonight? And it's a question that we need all to ask because no one knows when will be our last day here on earth. And so it brings us to this passage where Jesus is going to tell us something very important. That our life is not consisting of the abundance of our possessions. And most of us know that. But that question, or that statement, does leave something unanswered. Well, if my life does not consist of the abundance of my possessions, then what does my life consist of? What is the meaning of my life? And we're going to see that here in this passage. That question is going to be answered. But before we answer that question, there's some questions along the way that we also have to answer and recognize. And so let me bring you back to this passage here, beginning in verse 13 of Luke chapter 12. And just to set the context again of the setting, if you recall from last week, Jesus had left the Pharisees' house. He saw a crowd, a multitude, thousands of people coming to see him. And he used that as a teaching moment with his disciples to teach them about the mission and provision of their ministry. And then as he finishes that, someone in the crowd yells out to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." That's kind of a strange thing for somebody to yell out to Jesus. Most of these people are coming, we presume they're either sick and they need healing, they might have a demon to be cast out, they might be coming to see what miracles he's going to provide, they might even just be coming hopefully to hear his message. But this guy has the boldness to yell out, settle the inheritance between me and my brother. And Jesus replies to him, "Man, who appointed me the judge or arbiter between you?" This is not why I've come. I've not come to settle your petty disputes. So he somewhat dismisses the man, but he uses his opportunity as another teaching moment for his disciples. And he says very plainly, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. Which I think we all, again, know that to be true. But then he tells the parable to really drive the point home. And the parable is where I want to spend my time today. He starts out in verse 16. He says, "And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. Now there's something in that sentence that should jump out at you. Something that really drives home the very first point. And the answer is the subject of that sentence. Now if you look at that sentence, you might think the man is the subject, but it's not. The ground produced a good crop, not the man. The ground produced a good crop. You see, what the man doesn't realize, and what he will not realize through this passage, is that what he has, the wealth he has, the crops, the grains that he has, they weren't produced by him. They came from the ground. He might have prepared the ground, he might have planted the seed, but he didn't make the seed grow. Who made the seed grow? God made the seed grow, that's right. Another way of saying it is God produced a great crop for this man. The first point of this passage is everything you have, everything that you've been given, has come from the hand of God. You might think you've worked for it, and you have. All right, you might have gone out and done your job and all that, but it is God's blessing upon you to have that job. And it is God's blessing upon you to have the income you have. The shirt on your back, every material possession you have, all of your wealth is not yours. It was given to you by God. And we forget that sometimes, and that's the first point of this passage. And we have to remember that because it helps us through our way and through our lives. I'll tell you, when I was in seminary, I was getting near the end, but I had taken every nighttime class and every online class. But I still needed some courses that were required for graduation, and those courses were only offered during the day, during the week. And of course, I had a full-time job. And I had to make a decision, am I going to take off every Tuesday for the next 12 consecutive weeks so that I could go to classes during the day? Now that might sound, okay, well that's pretty good. Well, God had provided me with a vacation time through a long career. That was there. But my job was in sales. And if you know anything about sales, you aren't making money unless you're out there selling. You don't make money sitting in the office. You make money being out on the road. You're meeting with customers and you're making sales. I was contemplating taking one day a week off for 12 weeks. And frankly, that became 24 because I would do it in the fall as well, the spring and the fall. And I was concerned that if I take 20% of my selling time away, will my sales go down 20%? And I'm not going to be out there selling, so I am going to lose income was my concern. But I had to get out of seminary. I know the Lord had sent me there. And so I started taking off one day a week. And you know what happened? My sales went up. My sales went up. Now, it didn't make any sense to me. I wasn't out there working as hard as I had been. I was one day a week, I was gone. But my sales went up. And you know why my sales went up? Because God provided those sales for me. All right, even though I was out there the other 4 days working, more people were saying yes than before. And that was because God had laid it upon their heart to say yes, so that I would have not just the income I was making before, I even had more income. And that was helping me get through seminary. I was doing what God had told me to do, and He rewarded that obedience. He settled my fears. And so it's a reminder to me that everything that I have came from the hand of God. All right, and that's where I want you all to start today. Everything you have has come from the hand of God. All right, whatever you have, whatever little or lot, it has been given to you. And that next question then is, what are you going to do with it? What are you going to do with what God has given you? And the man has that same question as we go on. Verse 17, it says, he thought to himself, what should I do? Got all this stuff now, got this big harvest, what should I do? And he says, I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of goods laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. Okay? This man's decision of what he's going to do with the gift that God has given him is to put my feet up, store it all away for myself, and then take it easy and eat, drink, and be merry. Not a good stewardship decision. First thing he should be thinking of, being a Jew, is a tithe of my produce goes to the temple. He hasn't even thought about that. Doesn't think that, hey, with this windfall, maybe I can do something for my neighbor. There's no love of God, there's no love of neighbor in this man's mind. If you read it, it's all about him. What should I do? I have no place to store my stuff. This is what I'll do. I will tear down the buildings. I will store my grains. I'll say to myself, I. This man's whole concept is just about himself. What can I do for myself with my stuff? And that's what he's thinking. It's not uncommon, though. You talk about people winning the lottery. You know, the lottery is making a lot of news lately. If you say to someone, what would you do if you win the lottery? First thing people will say most of the time is, I'm quitting my job. I'm going to take life easy. I'm going to buy a new car, pay off my bills, buy a big house, go traveling, whatever it is. But again, it becomes that my, or I. I'm going to do for me. Rarely do you hear people say, I'm going to do something for someone else. And so that then begs the next question to ourselves. If you agree with me that everything you have has been given to you by God, then you have to ask yourself the question, what am I going to do with what God has given to me? Am I going to store it up for myself and have no concern for others? Am I going to advance the kingdom of God with what I have, great or little? Am I going to help out my neighbor, those in need? There's a homeless man who's wandering around. I met him this week. And I ran down to McDonald's and bought him breakfast, and I gave it to him. It wasn't a big thing, but it was an act of kindness. What are you going to do with what you've got? Think about it, because that's the next question we have. Everything we have has been given by God, and we are the steward of those gifts. And we need to decide what we're going to do with what He's given us. And we need to decide that because we don't know how long we're here on earth. But God said to him in verse 20, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you." This very night your life will be demanded of you. What will you do if you die tonight? Now what's interesting to me in this passage is the word demanded. Ἀπαιτέω is the Greek word. It means to demand something back. All right, to ask for something or really demand something back. And we saw this word previously in Luke. It was Luke chapter 6, verse 30, I believe. And Jesus had said, "Give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back." It was the same word, ἀπαιτέω. God is saying to the man, not just that you're going to die, but I am going to demand your life back. I gave it to you, and I can take it away. And really, it doesn't say life. The Greek word for life is zoe. But what it says here is your soul, your suke. I'm going to demand your soul back tonight. Because I have given you your soul, just like I gave you all the possessions, and you haven't done well with it. You have been a poor steward of the life I have given you. And that's a scary thought. All right, as I said, no one knows when their last breath will come. Every breath is a gift from God. And when you die, and every one of us will unless we're raptured first, when you die and you stand before the Lord, will He say, "Good and faithful servant," or will He say, "I never knew you"? You've got to make that decision. What are you going to live your life for? You know, we talked about your possessions. Malcolm Forbes was the founder of Forbes magazine, a publisher. He was at one time one of the richest men in the country, probably the world. And he's the one who is credited with the phrase, "He who dies with the most toys wins." Right? You've heard that before. All right? Well, he died. I don't think he won. He died at the age of 70 of a heart attack. All his stuff went to somebody else, and he went on to the next life, wherever that was. But if that was the attitude, it's an attitude reflective of this man. I'm going to keep it all for myself. I'm going to live life for myself. And I win in my mind because I had the most toys. All right, so it ends up here in verse 20. God says something else to him. Who will get what you have prepared for yourself? And all of this then begins to make us think about another book in the Bible. All right, this story is really very similar to another book in the Bible, an Old Testament book. An Old Testament book that I think the people would have known when they heard this, particularly when they read, "Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." The book I'm talking about is the book of Ecclesiastes. All right, the book of Ecclesiastes is all about the purpose of life. And if you're not familiar with the book of Ecclesiastes, I encourage you to read it. It's a fantastic book written by Solomon. Now, Solomon, if you don't recall, that was King David's son. He became the king. And when he became king, God said to him, "What can I give you?" And Solomon said, "Give me wisdom. Wisdom to rule your people." And God was so pleased with that answer, he says, "I'm going to give you wisdom, but because of that answer, I'm also going to give you riches and prosperity and wealth beyond imagine." And so Solomon is said to have been the wisest and wealthiest man who ever lived. So Solomon set out to find out what is the purpose of life. And having everything at his disposal, he decided to try everything. So he tried wisdom, which he was being given, but that didn't bring him any satisfaction. He tried foolishness. That didn't give him satisfaction. He tried using his wealth. He bought anything and everything. He spent his money on whatever his eyes saw and he desired. And that didn't bring him any satisfaction. He went from one extreme to the other, as you read through Ecclesiastes, trying anything, and nothing brought him satisfaction. And throughout the book, you read this refrain that life is meaningless under the sun. Life is meaningless under the sun. And the implication there, and as the book goes forward, I'll give you the spoiler. When you're looking under the sun, when you're looking horizontally, you're seeing things from an earthly view. If you're looking above the sun and you're looking vertically, you're looking up to God. And so your life is meaningless if you're just looking at the earthly possessions and the earthly relationships and the earthly things. But when you look up to heaven, above the sun, that's where you find meaning. Now, I said that this passage today reminded me of Ecclesiastes, and I'll read a passage from Ecclesiastes chapter 2, which will kind of pull it together. Verse 24 says, "A man can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in his work, or eat, drink, and be merry." And we read that refrain a couple of times in the Ecclesiastes. "This too, I see, is from the hand of God, for without him who can eat or find enjoyment? To the man who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth." Doesn't that sound strange? Did I read that wrong? To the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth? Why would God give a sinner the task of gathering and storing up wealth? Why wouldn't he give it to the righteous man? But that's exactly what's happening in this story of Luke. He's giving this sinner the task of storing up and gathering wealth. And it goes on. He gives this sinner the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God. So this man has worked all this time, gathered up all this grain and all these things, and stored it away. And that night, God declares this man's soul back so that he can give to the one he pleases all this man's wealth. And that's what it ends up at the end, verse 21 of Luke again. "Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself?" This whole passage of Luke is pointing back to Ecclesiastes. And that pointing back to Ecclesiastes is giving us the answer to the question that I posed from the beginning. If my life does not consist of the abundance of my possessions, what does my life consist of? And Jesus is pointing you back to Ecclesiastes and saying the answer to the purpose of your life was found in the Old Testament, in the book of Ecclesiastes. And that answer comes at the end of the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 12, the last book, the last few verses. Solomon, after he has done all these wild and crazy things with his money and his wisdom, and tried everything that you can imagine to make himself happy and find purpose in his life, he says in chapter 12, beginning at verse 13, "Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man." Fear God and keep His commandments. That is the purpose of your life. And when people hear fear God, they very often misunderstand that. Respect God, have reverence for God, have a relationship with God, and keep His commandments. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. That is the purpose of your life. And so this is a wonderful passage from Jesus to teach us many things that we need to remember. The first one is everything that we have has been given to us by God, including your very life. And you are the steward of your material possessions as much as you're the steward of your own life. And you need to choose what you're going to do with it. Because your life does not consist in the abundance of your possessions, in the money you have or the days you have left on earth. But the one thing that your life does consist of is your relationship to God. Back to Ecclesiastes. The purpose of your life is to love God and keep His commandments. And if you keep that in mind, your stewardship will fall into place. And all God's people said, amen.